So today I want to talk about how I remember where to go when I'm on my bike, about the idea of mental maps and noticing how I map my journey, how I consider space and how I learn where to go and how to get where I'm going. And one sort of important part of the way that I seem to think about these things is that it works in sort of nodes, that I think about these points where I change direction like this, where some change in activity is required. And here, I'm coming up towards some lights, I'm now speeding up. Normally I have to stop at these lights and wait, and this time I'm zooming through because unusually I've got the little green man to speed me on my way. Where the gaps in between, like now when I'm just going straight with no turning or changing, these points are much less memorable. So my mental map is actually really constructed primarily out of these junctions, these changes. Although, having said that, these streets in Ealing that I'm cycling through at the moment have a different kind of resonance for me, because this is where I grew up. This is where I used to cycle as a kid. And so there are very kind of resonant points for me, like this place on the right, which is now a Muslim college, used to be my primary school. And whenever I cycle through these streets, I'm kind of creating a resonance that is to do with some kind of aggregation of all my experiences there as a child. This street is where a girl called Monika Ludkowska used to live. And we're just approaching here. This street on the right is my street where I'd lived for the first 18 years of my life. And I've got very strong memories about several of the houses of that street where various friends used to live. But how do these memories of places relate to this idea of nodes of activity being the memorable thing? Well, as I'm cycling along here now, I'm just coming up to a parade of shops past this blue building where there used to be a barber's where my mum used to take me for haircuts when I was sort of 6, 7, 8, 9. It's gone now. It used to be called Mario's. But the activity of having my hair cut was important there. And just coming up now are a series of potholes that I have to, when I'm cycling, I kind of know that I've got to avoid. I may not remember exactly where they are, but I remember the process of having to swerve around to avoid them. And this idea of perception as active rather than passive is really important. It's that we do perception rather than that it happens to us. And the activity of perceiving and being in the world are also the activities of learning and creating new knowledge and memories for ourselves. And these ideas from authors like James Gibson and Tim Ingold are really important to both my sort of musicology but also my cycling map. And this moment is quite important in my map because there's a sort of release of tension as I zip off the road and get down onto the canal towpath. There's that little moment of, is there someone coming? And then we're off along the towpath. Now there are little nodes of activity along here where I have to change direction or think about things for a little while, and those are important. But the other thing is that while I'm cycling along here, when I first started, the thoughts that I had about the canal, the way that I would think about it, were very much coloured by the fact that my sister used to have a canal boat, and I'd really only been along this stretch on her boat at one time, and yet it was very, I found that sort of idea of the canal community very entrancing and interesting. Oh, look, a goose. But as I've become more and more engaged in cycling along here over and over again, I've developed my own set of memories, or a different set of memories rather, that are based around the boats that I see as I pass them. There are some of these boats that are very distinctive and others that are kind of moving around so you don't see them very often. There's this continual thing of passing pedestrians and cyclists and how that kind of creates a bit of tension, but also there's the sort of various things of etiquette that you have to develop as you're, who do you give way to and so forth. What's interesting to me is that my experience is continually rewriting my understanding of what this place is, of what the canal towpath is like, what it is. I read an article called The Empty Brain by a psychologist called Robert Eckstein recently, which said that your brain doesn't process information, retrieve knowledge or store memories. In short, your brain is not a computer. So he's saying that we don't store information as data, that information is stored as a process and an activity. My response to not being able to see round a corner is to ring my bell. So I've got, ironically, a Pavlovian response to this not being able to see stimulus that involves ringing a bell, as opposed to Pavlov's dogs learning to salivate when they hear a bell ring. Woo! So if memories are a process or an activity, they're constantly changing as they're constantly recreated through use or remembering, and we're also always adding connections based on new experience and even experience from the circumstances in which we last did that bit of remembering. So when I say that perception, knowledge and memory are all active processes, that leads me on to the idea that what we're doing is we're running a kind of simulation of what we think is happening that runs slightly in advance, just like this woman's slightly in advance of me, slightly in advance of the perception. We're always guessing what's going to be about to happen and checking against our sort of sensory input to see whether we were right or not. So if we're living a version of the world slightly ahead of what we actually perceive to be happening, then that might explain why, in some instances, emotion seems to happen before the actual event that we're perceiving. And this can be a destructive as well as a constructive activity. So by changing the likelihood of possibilities through new perceptions and new experience, I reduce some possibilities in relation to others, so I'm always changing what I think about the world. So memories are remade anew each time we trigger that memory. And that means that there are two quite interesting things here. The first is that I'm modifying my behaviour in the face of new experience, and that also modifies my understanding and knowledge of the situation that I'm in based on what I perceive to be the possibilities. And secondly, that idea of possibilities, well then the hypothetical and the unproven remain part of my understanding or my knowledge of that kind of situation. In addition to the fact that I'm constantly refining and changing my memory and knowledge, I'm also basing that understanding of whichever bit of the world I'm dealing with on a bunch of alternative truths, things I think are possible, although of course they may not be at all rational. So my understanding of these bits of the world that I'm cycling through are based on things that may no longer be true, like my childhood memories, things that are true, like the bumps in the road and so forth, and things that I think are possible but not necessarily happened. So, for example, just round this corner there's a slope that goes up quite steeply that I have to cycle up, and I usually speed up to get some momentum so that I can get up there quite easily. But today, as I come round this corner, there's a dog sitting in the middle of the towpath with people walking around each side of it, and I have to think about modifying my behaviour. So instead of speeding up, I have to stop and wait for this cyclist to come down and then change down to a lower gear and go up. So this modification of my behaviour is actually creating a new understanding of this space. And the other thing I mentioned, the idea of hypotheticals or alternative truths. As I'm coming along here, one of the things that I encounter quite often is little flocks of birds on the pavement like this. These pigeons here, that when I cycle towards them, they suddenly fly up, and although it's never actually happened, I am always considering the possibility that one might go under my wheel or fly up into my face or something, and it's causing me stress. It's a hypothetical or an alternative truth that is helping to define my map of my cycling journey. So anyway, coming off the canal here, getting to this junction at Maida Vale, turning here, stopping at these lights, getting back onto the towpath. These are all parts of my my map for getting home. Passing these big posh houses here, going past the zoo, going past this set of residential moorings here, and some things are different every day. This little motorboat, you don't often see that chugging along the canal, but we've got one in this instance. It's not always as busy as it is here. I don't always run into people, and in fact recently I've had to use this slightly different journey home because they're building a giant casino on the banks of the canal, and they closed some of the towpath for a little while. Here, just coming past my daughter's old school, and then going through Sainsbury's, and I'll never think about or remember that journey in the same way again.